Okay, so today was our inaugural animal behavior seminar talk. Thanks to those who came to that. It was a packed house. We had to bring some chairs in. So we'll try to find a bigger room for it in the next one when Clive Wynn was there. But for those who did attend, it was Amelia Martins, former president of Animal Behavior Society, very well known for work in multimodal communication. It's really a great example of how to bring these like topics together. So like all throughout her talk, she kept bringing up questions like why questions, and then she would also then pivot to mechanisms, and then she would talk about evolutionary implications, would talk about how you can have conflict at the behavioral level, even though a conflict at a functional level doesn't exist, and so proximate and ultimate separations. A lot of great ways to sort of bring together the topics that we're sort of introducing in this class, and then see how someone who's built a very long and prolific career on it is using those ideas to answer questions that ultimately, in her case, linked back to conservation and what's going to happen. What is sort of the behavioral intersection between increasing temperatures and the behavioral adaptations of these Scaloporus lizards that she studies, and what are those meaning? So I thought it was a pretty successful seminar today. The next one is in November, Clive Wynn on dogs. So again, it's an opportunity to sort of maybe help see the bigger picture when we sort of go into all these like small units here, and don't often get a chance to bring them together into one cohesive narrative like they can there. With that in mind, today is the Marginal Value Theorem lecture, so we'll get into what that means here in a second. Looking forward, all of your groups should be set. There were a couple of groups that I needed to help kind of come together there at the end. So if you were in one of those groups that I had to kind of assemble your group and let you know that your group is assembled, the member assignment, the names of team member assignment is still open. So go back and submit that with your completed group, and then I can give you credit for that assignment. And then look forward toward submitting that first group deliverable, which is down here, this selected organism and the context of that organism. So like in the case of, so like as an example, today in Dr. Martin's talk, she was mentioning that these Scaloporus lizards, they do push-up behavior in order to communicate with each other. And it turns out that how they modulate where their head is like a language. So different lizards have different languages. So imagine you were speaking by raising your head up and down in certain ways. That's kind of how these lizards communicate with each other. And they also at the same time have chemicals that they excrete from their legs. And as it gets hotter, then they go underground. And when they go underground, the visual signals don't work anymore because it's dark. So as they get pushed underground, then they become more sensitive to chemical signals. And so there's an obvious connection there of saying, well, these wall lizards, that's what she studies, the same lizards that are on cinder block walls running all around Phoenix. Then you can say like, well, if it gets hotter, as they seek refuges, then how does that affect their communication? And if their communication is vital for like sexual signaling and things like that, then that could have an impact on their population dynamics down the road. So because their behaviors need access to certain resources that become unavailable as it gets hotter. So that would be an example of something like, I'd like to study these wall lizards, and I noticed that they congregate in shady areas as it gets hotter and hotter, and I'm sort of interested in the effect of temperature on their behavior or something like that. That's the type of detail that we're sort of looking for. So what is your organism, and what is your motivation for building your project around that? So not a lot that we're looking for this first deliverable, but just to show that you've got some thought put into it. So I'm looking for like 1 to 2 paragraphs identifying the animal. If you don't know what the animal is, then if you've got a picture, that's great. If you just want to describe the animal, then we can try to sort of help you figure out what that is. You can take your best shot, but if you're not sure, then mention that I don't know. This is you might. I thought it was a tiny crow, and it turns out it's a grackle or something like that. But so if you're not sure, then say that you're not sure. But you can use another animal to kind of help describe what it is, and we can try to point in the right direction so you can figure out what you're looking at there. So ultimately, the goal is to develop a causal question, hypothesis, experimental design, and predictions. You won't be running this experiment, so you don't have to think about how am I going to actually do this, but it's just if I was to pitch an experiment to someone else and say, hey, if you funded me for this so I could buy a bunch of things, then this is the experiment that I would like to run. And they can be, relatively simple. Like a lot of behavior is arts and crafts, like going to, Michael's and buying things you can put together that forces animals to make certain decisions and see how they do it. But then now there are more sophisticated methods, like, doing differential expression and trying to understand, well, if I've got a group of animals that's behaving one way, another group of the same species another way, what genes are involved, and so on. So there are more sophisticated things, which if you feel like that's necessary, you could propose that. But my point is that you're not actually going to do the experiment, so the sky's the limit. So just looking for good formation of these causal questions, hypotheses, experimental designs, and predictions. No zoo stuff, no pets. So it can be stuff that's domesticated, like like if you wanted to study these rose-faced lovebirds that you see on campus, those are not a native species. They were released, years ago, and now they've just set up shop here. Those, I think, even though they're not necessarily native to Phoenix, there's still interesting questions you could study about them, but not like ungulates in a zoo. So that would sort of not, there wouldn't be a lot of interesting things you could study there. And then again, photo would be great if you want help identifying. So any questions about the group stuff moving forward? No, I would say that kind of accessible from the greater Phoenix area. Um, you could arguably do something that is, I would say something that is in Arizona would probably be, I mean, I'm looking for something that's relatively local. So Desert Southwest would probably be okay, but it's not something that I just want you to like read a case study on and then tell me about that. It'd be not something that I really ideally would like it to be something that you're inspired by as you're out, like either walking around or visiting family or traveling within Arizona that inspires you to come up with this. Yeah, definitely Arizona, and I'd say California. I mean, a lot of people are from around here. I'd say yeah, just kind of looking for something that allows you to ask questions that are related to Southwest fauna and anthropogenic hypothetical changes in behavior. So it's something that that like lives here and there's potential interactions with humans, and I'm going to test whether those interactions might be having an effect. Yep. Yeah. That's a great question. Two groups doing the same animal. So a lot of groups aren't going to know if they're doing the same animal. So one of the feedback that we're going to give is if two groups are doing the same animal and like taking exactly the same approach, we might suggest to the groups that maybe diverge a little bit. But like that's part of the reason we're having you submit this so we can catch those things. But it's not outlawed. It's just it'd be nice if we're both studying grackles, but I'm going to study grackles and water availability. They're going to do grackles and temperature or something like that. Any other questions? Yep. Yes. Now that you all have groups, then whoever submits it in your group, it'll automatically submit for everybody. Okay. Anything else? All right. So this is kind of where we left off, sort of extending this. So we've talked about Holling's disk equation last time, this idea that when you have the density of prey as it increases, it's going to increase the number of prey captured, but it's going to do it in this nonlinear way. So when there's very few prey, then small increases get similar sized increases in the number of prey captured. But because a predator can't eat a prey instantaneously, then eventually when prey are so available, then it's actually the predator's own handling process that limits their intake. So down here, we're kind of limited by search related factors, the speed of the predator, how dense the prey are. But because there's so much time between, like, if it takes you 10 minutes to find the next prey item, then if it takes you only a minute to eat the prey, then it's not going to slow you down that much to eat the prey. You're not going to lose out that much because it's going to take so long to find the next prey item anyway. And if the prey become more available, you immediately notice that because there's no overlap with your handling time. So if it only takes you a minute and now it takes you 5 minutes to find the next prey, then you still have plenty of time to eat the prey and then kind of find the next one. But things change when the prey are really available. And then at this particular time here, it's just impossible to eat all the prey because it takes so long to eat one prey that you miss out on the opportunity to eat the others. So at this point, it's really limited by the predator and the handling time, not the search process. That's basically Holling's disk equation right there, which we kind of defined all of the parameters of it here. So time is really important. The relative balance between how long it takes you to find the next prey item and how long it takes you to eat this prey item. The balance of those two things is really important to a foraging strategy, to a predation strategy. And that brings us to these sort of examples like here. So here we've got a bunch of these cicadas. They all come out at roughly the same time, and they're easy to find. So you get these broods that come out, and they're just everywhere. And if you want to eat a cicada, they're just it's easy pickings. You just can go out and eat them. Keeping in mind this up here, why do we think this is actually a productive reproductive strategy? Why would all of the cicadas want to come out at the same time and be so conspicuous and easy to find from the birds or whatever else that wants to eat them? What might be advantageous about this strategy relative to one where they kind of trickle out and you get a couple cicadas now and a couple cicadas later and so on? Again, thinking especially about this part up here of Holling's disk equation, this part in this region. Yeah. Well, there's a little bit of that. So but I mean, it's kind of a bigger, like there's a bunch of things there, right? If they do have an escape response, then there's a little bit of this vigilance that there's this kind of selfish herd that we'll talk about later in the semester, where if you're nearby a target, if something takes out that target, then it gives you an opportunity to get away. And maybe if there's a bunch of targets and the predator just picks one randomly, then it's very unlikely to be you. Whereas if you're the only thing on the tree, that's the thing the predator is going to go for. So that's definitely a part of this for sure. I think there's an even sort of more general point though here about, I guess the question of that, is it possible, like you would imagine that if you had this predator arrive at this tree, it would just mow down all these cicadas and it would just slurp them all up. But is that how predators eat? Is it possible for a predator to just eat all of these cicadas at once? Based on what we just talked about over here with Holling's disk equation. No, I mean, it takes time to eat, right? So if predator starts eating this cicada, then there's a bunch more cicadas available, but the predator eventually is going to get to a point where it doesn't need to eat anymore. And it's not like, again, it's limited by the time it needs to handle prey. And it's also sort of limited by its own energetic needs. And it doesn't need to eat all of those prey. And so this idea of predator saturation or swamping, it's also referred to as predator starvation, is this interesting thing where most of the year you starve the predator because you're just not available. The predator doesn't have you, there's none there. So that might reduce the numbers of predators. And then if you can manage to time all of your reproduction so you come out all at the same time, there's no way a predator is going to have enough time to be able to eat all of those. And so it's a bunch of these are probably going to make it. So this idea of a swamping strategy or saturation strategy is a great way to survive when you really don't have a lot of defenses. I mean, if these things have got these big birds that are just landing on top of them, picking them off, I mean, it's relatively easy to catch a cicada, even when you're, I mean, I'm not a cicada predator, and it's just pretty easy to catch a cicada. If you are adapted for cicada hunting, then it's really easy to catch a cicada. But they're they're kind of big and juicy. It takes a while to eat a cicada. And then so as you're eating it, you're not eating the other ones, and you get a lot of energy from one. And so probably a lot of them go free. So this idea of a saturation strategy or a swamping strategy, timing everything together is a way to hide in the handling time of a predator. So this idea that, if you were down here, if all of these cicadas came out, trickled over the year, then there'd be predators that are hungry that would just eat them up one by one, and they might eat all of them. But in this strategy, you force it so that you force the predator into this region here, where most of the rest of the year, that predator might not survive because it has no food at all. And then the one time a year when it has food, it has too much food to know what to do with. That's a saturation strategy. And it's based on this idea of handling time, changes how productive the predators are. All right, questions about that idea? Saturation as being a reproductive strategy to survive predators by bringing all of the prey out at once. Now, of course, there's other things that limit intake. So, I mean, here's a cicada, here's a bird eating that. That's going to take up a lot of room inside the bird. So we're also going to talk about next time, not only the effect of handling time, but also the effect of gut capacity. And so, I mean, this predator just fills up. So the predator takes a while to eat each bug, eat each cicada. It also can only eat a couple of them, and then it has to move on. So bringing all the cicadas out at once is a reproductive strategy that works. And that's why we get these giant broods of cicadas. It's a survival strategy. It's not necessarily about like finding a mate or anything like that. It's because cicadas are nice, big, juicy prey. And if they came out in a slow trickle, they probably would not survive as well as if they come out all at the same time. Does that make sense, that idea? We're trying to see how much time really changes the way prey affect, how the way prey behave, as well as the way predators allocate their resources. Okay. All right. So when we talk about predation, there's a bunch of different categories. I'm going to sort of declutter this in just a second here. But I just kind of put things in this orientation here to show how some of these things overlap, where they don't. So, we talk about scavenging. So in that case, your prey is already dead. So, you can imagine that the way a predator scavenges is probably very different when the prey are guaranteed to not be able to run away. And that's, has some overlap with, with herbivory. Those plants can't run away either. And there's scavenging on dead plants too. So there's overlaps there. That feed into predation. Normally when we think about predation, we think about pursuit predation, running after prey. But we also have sit and wait or ambush predation, where you sit and wait for the prey to come to you, and you have to sort of try to be as inconspicuous as possible so that the prey will just come into that. And then on this side over here, we've got parasitism, which in this case, we talk about a host stays alive. That's the key difference between parasitism and predation. But there's this cool intermediate called parasitoidism. So a parasitoid is something that eventually kills the prey, but it does it in such a slow way that it is parasite-like. So if something were to lay its eggs in you, and then over a very long time period, those eggs develop, and eventually it takes your reproductive success, eventually it kills you, then that would be an example of parasitism. But while you're alive, like you're alive through a great deal of that development. So it overlaps a lot with parasitism. So interesting overlaps here. And when we look at the different strategies for each one of these boxes, it's kind of interesting to think about where they overlap, why they're different, and how their differences relate to these different histories here. So so I'm not going to go through all of these, but I could kind of group them into, it's all about time. Predation is all about managing time. And so in the sit and wait case here, the only way you can manage time is by trying to increase your encounter rate with prey. And how do you do that? Maybe you hide yourself more. Maybe you find ways of expanding the region in which you can catch prey that come closer to you. And we're going to see some examples of that. Whereas like pursuit predation on the other side of that, now you're the one mobile. And so you manage encounter rate by chasing after the prey. So the prey could be mobile, the prey could be stationary, but you're now not trying to bring prey to you, you're trying to go and find the prey. So very different movement strategies. And then in the middle here, all of these other ones here, at this point, we're talking about where this is where opportunity costs become really big, because you have to balance the exploitation of things you discover versus the time it takes to explore for new things. And so, we don't see as much of that opportunity cost, over here with our sit and wait predation. But we do see that, with the plants, like, are there berries on this plant? At what point do I search for a new plant? And so on. So that's what we're going to be focusing on primarily today is here. But I want to start a little bit with the other ones first. So that's the basic overview of what it means to be a predator, is one of these boxes. So we start with sit and wait. Then, you've been reading about the burrowing owls in that reading assessment. Spiders is another great example of that. They just sit there with a giant web. So what's the purpose of the giant web? It's to extend their body. It's an extended phenotype so they can catch more things. So more things kind of come into them. Anglerfish is an example of these that live in very dark areas that can create a little bioluminescent light off of that. And that light attracts prey to them. And it's so dark that they can kind of hide in the darkness, and things are attracted to this light. And then at the last minute, then they can jump and they can catch these things. So, but bringing things to it. And then similar to these other kind of benthic or these sort of bottom dwelling fish that live in these dark areas, like these stargazers, where, it's about being cryptic and luring things to you, or using traps in order to increase your encounter rate. But in all of these cases, these adaptations are for increasing encounter rate by bringing prey to you more often. I think I have a nice example of that in this video. So this is a ray spider. So there's a mosquito on a stick here. This is a ray spider that has this web, and it has a single thread that it anchors over here, and it sets up a slingshot. And when an insect gets close to the web, then it doesn't want to risk, like the insect not hitting the web. It actually launches its web at the insect to catch it. So it's like it's trying to net the insect with its own web. So, that's kind of, I think it's kind of cool that, and they even have these like, like directional responses. And so they're showing that somehow it's able to tense the web so that it can fire it in particular directions at these oncoming prey. So those are the types of adaptations we expect, and they are primarily to increase the encounter rate with prey that come nearby. That's how a sit and wait predator gets its advantage, in the ray spider. So that's our, the ray spider there. Now on the other side of it, active foragers, the ones that aren't just sitting and waiting there, they can be foraging, they can be searching, they can be moving around the landscape to find prey, and then while they're moving around, they have to decide in everything that they do, how do they manage the opportunity cost of the other things they could be doing, but they aren't because they've decided to pursue prey in this particular area, pursue this particular prey, and so on. So I have to manage that. And that is the key problem in most of these foraging decisions. So, so because of that, we would predict that for these active foragers that have to make decisions as they're moving around, the handling time of the prey we predict that we're going to see behaviors that are sensitive to that handling time. So if you give them prey that they're familiar with that has a low handling time, we might expect to see different decisions when you give them prey that has a high handling time. And those are the types of models and examples that we're going to see between today and the next one. Okay, so let's try to get into some examples of that. So one of the things we would predict is there's a bunch of animals that live in a central place, so-called central place foragers. Honeybees are central place foragers. A bunch of birds are central place foragers. They have a nest. They don't eat things where they find it. They have to bring it all the way back to the nest. What does that do to bring things all the way back to the nest? It increases the handling time of the things that you find. So normally, if you're just a forager that can eat on the go, then it might take you a couple of seconds to munch, a little insect that you found, and then you move on. But if you have to add 5 minutes of flight before, because you have to bring that insect back to your central place, maybe to feed to your offspring, then suddenly not only is it how long does it take to eat the insect, but how far away you are, because that effectively increases the handling time. And we would expect to see central place foragers are going to then be sensitive to how far they are away from their nests. And that's, again, all about timing. And it's also about energy, that it can, you lose energy the farther out you are. So this nice juicy morsel, by the time you bring it back home, it might not have as much energy left over. But also that we should see, even when you control for that, we should see an effect of the time it takes, the handling time. So that's the key thing I want you to remember about central place foragers, is that the distance from the nest is like taking longer to eat the prey. So we can set up experiments where we have the exact same prey, but we put them at different distances. And we should see similar decisions to when we take a bunch of prey at the same distance, but we alter them so they take longer to eat. And a bunch of experiments have shown that for central place foragers, they're sensitive to that. Okay, so clear what I mean by central place foraging, and this idea that the distance from home is effectively makes it a longer handling time. Yeah. Well, that's a good question. So the normally when we use central place foragers as model systems, we're usually modeling decisions made about things that they bring back, and we're seeing, are they sensitive to this? Now, there might be metabolic needs of this particular forager that they will just eat on the go, but if we're focusing on how central place foraging affects behavior, then we usually focus on things that are bringing back to their offspring. Yeah, so it's a good question. It's about picking model systems. Yeah, that's exactly it. And so this will be clearer when in on Thursday, right? Yeah, on Thursday when we talk about prey choice. A bunch of central place foraging work, the way it's been done, is you give them choices between, like, here's a blueberry, here's a blackberry, here's an insect or whatever. And when they're at a particular distance, they have a certain shot. They always go for blueberry. But once you get far enough apart, then they will start going for blackberry and insect. So it's like the only thing that's changed is the distance. Yeah. And so we'll try to predict on Thursday, if you know the handling time, what that pattern will be. And when you work with a central place forager, then the typical ranking doesn't work until you add the distance or the time to the handling time. So that's kind of the key insight in central place foraging, is that most early work on prey choice was not about central place foragers. It was about animals just walking around deciding, do I eat that or do I ignore it? And that's the problem we're going to be focusing on Thursday. Those models failed when there were central place foragers until they added in the time it takes to fly home. And once you add that in, the ranking then goes back to what we actually see the animals doing. Okay. So questions about that. Those are our basic background before we start getting into the marginal value stuff, which is the bulk of today. that I want you to take away from today. Okay. All right, so let's do a clicker. So as you can see, question here, what type of predator are carrion birds like vultures? So carrion birds, they eat dead flesh. They don't forage on live things. So that's a particular type of predation. What's the predation? Is it A, scavenger? And think of it the closest match. A, scavenger, B, carnivores, C, herbivores, or D, ambush predators. What category do we put that into? So I'll give a second. Yep. Oh, that's weird. Let me try stopping and let me try reopening the class. It's open here. Okay. Is that open for everybody else? Okay. That's weird. Might be like a network thing between my office and here. Okay. So hopefully relatively easy one there. So just mainly vocab lookup. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I'll leave that up there. Just remember scavenger, carnivore, herbivore, ambush. All right. Okay, so the key thing that I want to talk about here, that I'm most excited about today, is this question of not what we're going to talk about what prey to choose on Thursday. We'll go into that. I will be excited about that. What I'm excited about today is how long should a forager stay in a patch? What the heck is a patch? That's another thing too. But it's this, again, we're focusing on time today. How long? So the predator is not choosing whether I eat or not. It's choosing how long do I search in this local area. So let's drill down into that. So the idea here, the picture we have here, is that you've got this a forager that, like this bee, that is on a flower, and it stays on this flower. There's all sorts of exploitation it can do on this one flower. It can stay there for a certain amount of time, and then it'll move to this flower. It'll stay there for a certain amount of time, then it'll move to this flower, stay there for a certain amount of time, and then this one. It doesn't get anything in between the flowers, but it gets things while it stays on the flower. This is what we refer to as patchily distributed prey. So a patch is a region of a heterogeneous environment. So it's a clumpy environment where all of the returns are clumped here, clumped there, clumped there, and clumped there, and not anywhere in between. That's what we mean by this is a patch. It is one of those areas where the clumps are. And so while the bee is in one of these patches, then there's a little return curve that it sees. So it goes into the patch, and initially, like it goes into this patch here, initially it's got nothing from the patch, no calories at all. But it starts finding nectar, for example, in this, and then it keeps moving around to find more nectar. Initially, it's really easy to find nectar. And so you get a rapid rise in the calories it gets from this patch here. But over time, it starts depleting all the nectar in this flower. And there might be nectar, but it has to search really hard to find it. And so to get this last little bit of nectar out of there, it has to spend a lot of time doing this micro search for it. So this looks like Holling's disk equation, but it's not. Remember, Holling's disk equation has got density on the x-axis, not time. So this is just a depletion effect. As you're moving through the patch, you gradually deplete all the rewards until eventually you get close and close to the maximum, all the nectar in that particular flower has been sucked out of it at that particular point there. And the question really is, so how long do you stay in here? Do you wait until you get all of the nectar, or do you leave at some intermediate point? And how does the position of the other patches affect when you leave this patch? That's what we want to focus on here. So let's zoom in on one of these patches and focus on these so-called diminishing marginal returns. What does that mean? That means that the marginal returns are like for every second, how many calories do I get? So that's what a marginal return is. So for every little time unit, how much do you get out of that little time unit of investment? So if I have a second of investment, I get a lot of calories here. But up here, if I do a second more of investment, then I get very little out of it. So the marginal returns is for each additional time unit, how much extra energy or reward do I get out of this flower? And when you see shapes like this, which again, the x-axis is time here, not density. This is not Holling's disk equation. When you see curves like this, we refer to them as having diminishing marginal returns. For those that are more mathy here, if you took the derivative of this thing, the derivative would start high, it has a high slope, and it gets low. It eventually goes to a low slope. The derivative of these things, that's the marginal returns of this patch. So it's diminishing marginal returns. And then the question is then, given those diminishing marginal returns, when do we leave? So we probably don't want to leave very early because it is very easy to find the rewards here. So maybe we stay longer to get more of these rewards, which are coming in at a fast rate. But we probably don't want to stay all the time until here, because at some point we're spending so much time here trying to get this little bit of extra calories. If there's a flower nearby, just go to the new flower, because the new flower, you're going to start out, and if nobody else is foraged there, you're going to start back down here for the new flower. So that's the idea here. Every time you search, you're looking for a flower that puts you back in this really rich region of the flower space. But as you stay in the flower, you get to the poor region. And so at what point do you switch from giving up on this flower to look for a new flower where you start out in the rich region again? That's the question we're trying to solve. All right, any questions about this setup so far? Is it clear what this curve is representing and how it relates to flower foraging? And this could be anything. It doesn't have to be flower foraging. This could be, I'm a wolf and I just took down a moose. How long do I sit here and chow down on the moose before getting up? That's, another thing that, that could also be viewed as a patch, because they're probably not going to eat the whole moose. So what fraction of the moose do you eat? Same sort of idea. So we're looking for that time. Yep. The graph is an average across, we're assuming there's one patch type. They're all flowers that look like this. So we're saying that if we tasked a grad student off to go off and sample each one of these flowers, then what we would find is, on average, if you spend an average of this amount of time, you're getting an average of this reward. So you can, if it helps, you can think of this as one flower, but we can imagine that you have this curve for each of these 4 flowers, and you could average across those curves, and this would be the average reward you get for flowers of this type. All right, any other questions about that? Okay, so this is our gain from a single patch, or an average across single patches. And we are going to connect it to Holling's disk equation. So, we want to say, okay, if this is what I'm getting locally at one patch, what's my rate of return from the whole environment, from my entire foraging session? And that, remember, we use Holling's disk equation as a good first model for understanding that. Holling's disk equation was up here. So remember, this A is basically the speed of the animal, D is the density of the patches, and H is how much time you spend in the patches. Now I can take this and I can reorganize it to be a little more manageable. So if I divide the numerator and the denominator by AD, then I get this thing, which is just equivalent to this over here. And this 1 divided by AD, remember, A is kind of like the speed of the animal, D is like the density of patches. Well, this 1 divided by AD, I'm just going to call S, which will be the average time between patches. So if I speed up, then that's a way that I can increase or decrease the average time between patches. If I increase the density of the environment, that's another way that I can decrease the average time between patches. So S is the time in between patches, H is the time in each patch. So this here is basically how often you find a patch. This is my rate of encounters with a patch. That's my Holling's disk equation here. So what I want to do is combine these two to figure out what's the reward I'm getting for the whole environment. And so that's what I do here by multiplying my marginal return, or my single patch returns with that rate, that encounter rate, basically. So this here is basically telling me that this is the benefit I get for every patch on average. And I spent this much time cost to get that benefit. So every patch I had to search for, and then I had to spend time in to get the rewards out of it. So that S is how much it took me, how long it took me to find it. And this is how long I was inside that patch to get these rewards. And so that averages out of the whole environment to give me kind of an exchange rate in this foraging economy. So for a particular environment, if it's a really rich environment, then I'm going to have a low search time between patches, and that's going to make this rate high, which means for every unit that I put in, I get a high return out. But likewise, if I have a very long time between patches, then that means that for every unit of time I put into foraging, I don't get much gain out. I don't get many calories out. So that will be a low exchange rate. So I'm exchanging one currency, my time, for another currency, my calories returned from foraging. And that's my interpretation here. So that's just derived from taking our gain from a single patch, combining it with our Holling's disk equation, and then we get this rate of gain from the environment. So this is the gain from one patch, and this is the gain from the whole environment, the rate of gain from a whole environment. Questions about that so far? Okay. So we're going to use that to try to figure out how long to stay in this patch. Okay. So how would we do this? So I'm not going to have you do this derivation just for those that are interested in the math. There's a brief window into some of the math behind the scenes. The base I'm going to say is I have a foraging strategy. How long does the forager spend in the patch? That's what needs to vary, H. So the forager, if the forager is behaving optimally, it would choose a good handling time, H, the time in the patch, that would maximize its rate of gain over the whole environment. So how would I solve that? Well, if I go back to high school calculus, if I want to maximize something, what do? I take the derivative relative to the thing that I'm changing. So I'm going to take the derivative of this thing relative to handling time. It's a quotient, so you get some quotient rule stuff. I set it equal to 0. So where does the slope equal to 0? And I solve for the handling time that makes the slope 0. Again, I'm not going to quiz you on this stuff, just for those wanting to know where it comes from. This is the basic background here. And so when I set this thing here, this rate of change of the global rate of return from the environment relative to the handling time in each patch, then it basically makes the numerator, this part of the numerator is equal to this part of the numerator, and I get this expression down here. And so this is going to be the key expression that we're going to see through the rest of these slides. This is going to be what is the so-called marginal value theorem, which I'm going to put up here in just a second. But this is just saying that this is the derivative. So so it starts high and it goes low. So if you took the derivative of this single patch curve, the derivative starts high and then it falls, diminishing marginal returns until you hit the rate of return from the environment. And this should make a little bit of sense. What this is saying is that I get a very high rate of return when I first enter this patch here. It's so high, it's going to be higher than the rate of return I get from the background environment. So in that case, it would be dumb to leave this patch because the background environment gives me a lower rate of return than the patch does. So I stay in the patch. But at a particular time, then the slope here is going to be equal to the rate that I'm getting from the whole environment. And at that particular time, I leave because at that time, the return I get from searching is equal to the return I get from staying. And so I stop and I go and I search. And that's basically how it's going to be set up here. So that I can show this graphically in this nice little model that I think usually helps conceptually picture what's going on. So if I plot, and this is the so-called marginal value theorem. If I plot my gain within a single patch here, and again, this is the expression that I'm building up here, then I want to find this point I'm calling H star where this condition holds. Well, if I look at this, I can interpret this geometrically, that this looks a little bit like a rise, and this looks like a run. So remember, this is the instantaneous slope. It's a derivative. It's the slope at this particular point, whatever this point is. And a slope, what's a slope? A slope is a rise over a run. Well, I already see that I've got a rise here of this numerator here of GH. That's already in there. I've got part of the run. This is H. So that's within the denominator. So if I just extend a line this way, which is the search time between patches, and I plot my S, my other part of that denominator down here, then I build a little triangle in this nice little graphical framework. I plot my gain on one side, and then it's like I just create a new axis, which is the search between patches on this side. And if I just anchor a diagonal line right at wherever this search time is, so this here, this is the search time between patches. This is the handling time within a patch. And if I just anchor a line here and just let it fall down to where it just kisses this curve, that is what calculus predicts is the optimal time that I can spend, that I should spend in a patch. And this graphical perspective here allows me to imagine what's going to happen if the environment gets richer or gets poorer, because you can picture what happens to this diagonal line, or picture the point at which it kisses this curve. And that's what we're going to see here in a second. So well, maybe before I ask for questions, let me just show that there. So the idea here is that it's really steep initially when I go into the patch, is steeper than the return from the environment. So the slope of the purple line is the return from the whole environment. The slope of the blue line is the return from this patch. This patch is better than the environment right now. So I stay in the patch. But eventually I get to a point where over here, the patch is shallower than the environment. So I should leave the patch. I should not. It's a waste of my time to be in the patch after this point. So this is the optimal leaving time, and happens to be exactly where the slope of the patch is equal to the slope of the whole environment. So if you buy that, then it allows us to play these games. What if I make the patches farther apart? So if I spread these patches out, then the picture just moves that purple line out, and that's going to, its point where it kisses that curve is going to be moved that way. So if I take patches and I now make them farther apart, then I would predict an animal will spend longer in every patch. And that kind of makes a little bit of sense, because if it's so hard to find a patch, if it is harder to find a patch, you should embrace the rewards you're getting within every patch you find more and spend more time there. But on the flip side of that, if it's easier to find a patch, so now patches are very close together, so you don't spend much time in between them, then in that case, you can leave each patch sooner, because once this patch starts to become a little less rich than it was when you started out, you give up and you say, I can find a new patch. And that new patch will be just as rich as this patch was when I started. So the closer they get, then the more you just go from patch to patch to patch. The farther they get apart, the more you start exploiting the patches you can find, because it takes so long to find the next patch. That's the essence of the marginal value theorem. Questions about that? This diagram makes sense. I think I have a summary of these 3 points here. So you can imagine I've got 3 different environments. I've got a rich environment here, where all the patches are close together. I got a poor environment here, where all the patches are farther apart. In the rich environment, we predict the animal to stay the shortest in all the patches. In the poor environment, to stay the longest on all the patches. So this has been useful for conservation. Like initially, people, when they were putting highways through these foraging areas, then they would say, well, we've now cut an animal off from these different regions, so we're going to enhance the areas next to the highways by planting more forage for an animal to find. And what they found is that in those cases when they did that, animals were crossing the street way more than they would before they planted. What do you think was going on there? Why would animals be crossing the street more after you enriched the sides of the street? with lots and lots of patches, lots and lots of bushes. You just plant bushes down the street because you're trying to make up for all the area that the animal now wouldn't be, and you want to sort of keep them all on that side and be happy with that side. And now they're just crossing the street all the time. What's our explanation? What have you done to the environment by putting a bunch of high quality landscaping all down the road? Yeah. Yeah, I would say it. The way you phrase it, I'd say it makes the opportunity for staying higher, which is kind of what you're saying. It takes it for lower. So that if there's a bunch of landscaped patches that are just right next door, across the road or next door this way, then at that point, it's the animal's not going to stay in the patch. They're going to be looking for a new patch most of the time. And so that's what you find out is that what behavior tells you is that if you just enrich these areas around these roads, then you're going to actually be encouraging animals to cross the road because they're patches that are very nearby, just right across the road. So instead of staying in those patches, then they're going to then leave those patches earlier and run across to the next patch, run across the next patch. They might be running next to the road, but they're going to stay near the road is the point, because that's where there's a rich environment and they're going to be moving around a lot. Now, I'm not saying you should take away all their forage, but you can't just expect that it's going to form like a fence they're going to now just be happy and they're going to all like allocate to one bush and just stay in that bush. And if anything, they're going to start moving more between the bushes because you've now enriched the environment. And if the environment is richer, the animal is going to want to be out of the patches, not in the patches. So that's the key note here with the marginal value theorem is it's about the balance of time, searching versus exploiting. And if you make a rich environment, the animal's going to rather be searching. And that was one of these key lessons when you start developing these corridors and so on. You have to be careful about these things. Questions about that? Okay. So this example that I've been giving, this was with one patch type, just those blue flowers. And this is the average rate of return for just those blue flowers. Well, we can actually extend this to imagine what if you had blue flowers with one gain, one curve, red flowers with another curve, and so on and so forth. So if you do something like that, then you're going to have the red flowers might be really rich. And what that means is that you can stay in them for a very long amount of time before you start feeling the depletion. But maybe the blue flowers are very poor, which means that once you eat a few berries out of it, it's really hard to find any more berries. So what you see if you have three different types of patches, the marginal value theorem is going to predict the time you spend in each based on these parallel lines. And so the environment sets the slope that is in common on the leaving time for each one of these patches. So if I look at this rich patch up here and this slightly poorer patch and this really poor patch, they stay in the rich patch longer. They stay in the intermediate patch a little shorter than that, and they stay in the poor patch not very long at all. But what's in common across these is the slope at each one of these depletion curves is identical across them. But because in the rich patch, it takes longer to hit that slope, it takes longer for your returns to deplete to that point, then you stay longer in that patch. So that's the picture that you get. So we have two predictions. If you have only one patch type, the spacing between the patch types will affect how long you stay in that patch. But if you have multiple patch types, the richness, the relative richness of those patch types to each other will predict how they balance the portfolio of their time. They stay longer in richer patches and shorter in poorer patches. But the cool thing about it is across all of the patches, they stay until the same giving up time or the same giving up density. So you can measure kind of the density of berries that they reach, and they'll give up at the same density of berries for all three of these, but it just takes longer to reach that giving up density for the rich patch than it does for the poor patch. Does that make sense? So how animals balance their time in a complex environment. The poor has a shorter time. So this is the poor one here. It, oh yeah. So what we're saying. Oh, so the idea. So this is saying across. If we made this a poorer environment, which would mean we're going to take all these patches and we're going to make them all sparse. And so, like, instead of having 100 of each, we're going to have 10 of each. So if we make it harder to find all patches, what that does is this purple line, which determines how long you stay in all of these patches, that purple line, which is parallel, it's the same purple line for all three of these, will get shallow. So as you make the environment poorer, you make this purple line flatter, and that will make the time you spend in all three patches longer. But it still will be the case that you'll spend the most time in the richest patch and the least time in the poorest patch. So this down here is talking about for the whole environment, you spend longer time in all patches, but they stay ordered this way. Yes, the whole environment just becomes sparser. So there's just less patches available. And so when there are less patches available, the time you spend in every patch just shifts over here. But the pattern still stays the same. One is still above two, is still above three. So that's what we're kind of saying here. Those are our two predictions, is that this is our, if you change the environment, you spend more time in all. But if you then just change the patch, then you spend more time in the richer patch. Those are the two predictions of the marginal value theorem. So questions about those predictions, where that comes from. Okay. And so for those who've taken microeconomics, this should look familiar. This is just the so-called equimarginal principle. So it basically was a rediscovery of the equimarginal principle by behavioral ecologists without any reference to the economics work. But if you look at how economists model consumer choice, like when you go to the grocery store, how much do you buy of one object or one product over another? And it has to do with how much value those products bring you. And you balance your investment across those products based on how much you get back from them. And it turns out that you balance them in a way that balances the marginal returns from every product. So the amount of money that you spend on television has to do, the marginal value you get from television tends to balance out the marginal value you get from groceries. And so that's how you end up balancing your fixed budget. Well, animals have a fixed time budget. You have a fixed dollar budget. The solution is the same. You get this equimarginal principle where at the optimal decision-making strategy, what we predict is the marginal gains, calories per unit time, will be equal across all options. Just like, value per unit dollar will be the same across all your options in consumer choice theory and economics. So it's just the economics of foraging is really what we're seeing here. Okay. And does it work? So these are real data. These are data that happen to be from ants, but there have been a bunch of tests of this. So on this side, they created relatively richer patches, and then they looked to see how long ants spent in those patches. And it turned out that the marginal value theorem ends up predicting that they spend according to this pattern. If you this kind of linear relationship here, that if you go from 10 to 20 to 30 in terms of sucrose concentration, they spend longer and longer. So the sucrose concentration predicts how long they stay, but then also the distance from nest predicts how long they stay as well. So if you make the patches very, you put a bunch of space in between patches, you put a bunch of space between a patch and the nest, then in that case, they'll end up spending longer in the patch. So that's what we're saying here, is that as they get farther away from the nest, as there's more travel time between that, then in two different species, we see an increase in how long they stay in it. So when they're really far from the nest, or when they're at patches that are very far spaced apart, when they find that patch, they spend longer in it. And then if their patches just really close to the nest everywhere, then they go into those patches that come right back out. Exactly what we'd expect from the marginal value theorem. Questions about that? So it seems to work, seems to help predict behavior. It sort of gives us, it helps bolster the hypothesis that animal behaviors can be explained by rate maximization. Okay. All right, so what else can we do with that? So it's not completely about foraging. There's a very similar problem in these marine mammals. So in a marine mammal, it's a really interesting problem for a marine mammal in that you can't get your oxygen out of the water, but your food is all under the water. So how do you deal with that? How long do you spend under the water before you come up to refill your lungs? And it turns out that that problem, the time at surface to oxygen intake ratio, that's basically another one of these little patches. So every time you come up to the surface, it's like you're in a patch, but you're not foraging for calories anymore. Now you're foraging for oxygen. So how much oxygen do you get at the surface before you dive back down? And it turns out we can solve that using the marginal value theorem as well. And so that's what people have done. So this is optimal diving theory. So in this case, they've modeled oxygen stores on the y-axis. They've modeled the time at the surface on the x-axis here, and then you've got this time in between. So how much time? This is how much time you spend on the surface. This is how much time you spend underwater. And so when you spend time underwater, you deplete your oxygen stores. That's why this starts way down here. Because when you come up to the water, you have to then refill the oxygen that you've taken out of your lungs and then potentially get more oxygen in your lungs. But the solution to this is exactly the marginal value theorem. So you can take this plot, if you know how long it takes for an elephant seal or a whale or whatever to refill its lungs, you can plot this plot here, and you can figure out based on how long they're spending under the water, based on prey availability, how long would we predict them to spend at the surface? And it's just the marginal value theorem all over again. And it's not only optimal diving. This problem that we have right here, this is time between patches, oxygen needed for moving between patches, optimal time at surface. This also applies to electric vehicles. So when we think about it, there's at a certain time you spend at a charger charging up. This doesn't quite work for gas vehicles. There's a certain time you spend in between chargers driving around. So the driving is the good thing, like being underwater eating. That's what the marine mammal wants to be doing. Being actually driving to your destination, that's what you want to be doing, but you can't stay underwater forever. You can't be driving forever. Eventually you have to recharge. Eventually you have to get oxygen. And the optimal time that you spend at a charger, it's rare that if somebody who's driving an electric vehicle, you don't charge up to 100%, because the time it takes to get from 80% to 100% might be 45 minutes to an hour, but the time it takes to go from 20% to 80% might be 15 minutes. So there's that balance there. If I spend 15 minutes, I get to 80%, then I actually get to spend more of my time driving. And that might mean I stop more often, but when I stop more often, I don't spend as much time. So again, it's like optimal diving theory. It maps perfectly onto electric vehicle charging. And both of them are explained by the marginal value theorem. So a lot of really cool applications for the MVT. And then the last one I'll bring up here, parasitoid oviposition. So you have a wasp that is a parasitoid, which means it's going to lay its eggs in the larvae of another insect, and gradually those eggs are going to eat the larvae from the inside out. But the wasp has a finite number of eggs. So how many eggs does she lay in each patch of larvae? Well, it turns out you can model that with the marginal value theorem. And you can predict that if it's a sort of a sparse patch of larvae versus a slightly higher patch versus an even higher patch, you can predict how much time the wasp is going to sit there laying eggs. And it really matches the data very well. So a lot of things you can predict with the marginal value theorem. It's this fundamental, really valuable theory, originally for foraging, but has now been applied to a bunch of other application areas. So any questions about that, the MVT? Yeah. Well, so the idea here is typically like if you go to an area that there's a bunch of things that can affect it. The simplest thing to imagine is kind of think larvae are like berries in a bush. So if I land in a particular, like a nest of another insect, and the larvae are kind of spaced out, kind of sparse, then I would have this low quality curve. So I end up depleting the larvae that are there very quickly. But if I instead find a really big ant nest or something like that, that has lots and lots of larvae that are just in piles and piles, then in that case, I don't feel the depletion effects. And so that's this kind of upper curve. So like the density and number of larvae at a particular location is sort of the easier thing to imagine is related to patch quality. Yeah, well, so yeah, that's a great question. That's more like that's what we call a lumped model. So that's more like what we talked about on Thursday. Like, is it worth my time to lay an egg here? And it's just a single like, is it worth my time to eat this thing? And then once I eat this thing, I have to move on. So these are special problems. Patch problems are problems where as you eat, you always can eat more. And so the question is, when do you stop eating? Great questions. Any other questions? Okay. So last thing I wanted to cover before we finish here. The other important thing about time is time constraints, and that's risk sensitive foraging. So we've so far been talking about averages, the average return from the environment, the average return from a patch, but what about variance? I'm not going to talk about this too much, and this is mainly going to be graphical here. But the idea here is you've got birds that are deciding, or people or whatever, between a prey that is always 5 calories or a prey that sometimes is nothing and sometimes is 10 calories. This is like being on a game show and so they give you an envelope, and the envelope, they can say, this envelope has $5 in it. This envelope, let's say, has $500 in it. This envelope could be empty or has 1,000 in it. And so your question is, which envelope do you pick? And in that case, how much rent you have to pay probably factors into that decision. If your rent is $250, then the $500 envelope will pay your rent for the month. If your rent is $750, then it's possible that you'll pick the envelope that's a 0 or 1,000, and the 0 won't help you. But the 500 doesn't really help you either because you still can't pay your rent off of 500. So based on your deficits, you might choose a variable option because sometimes it gives you what you need when the constant option all the time doesn't give you what you need. So at what point do you choose the variable versus choosing the consistent rewards? So the idea here is where they starve birds for different amounts of time. So you've got a bird after an hour. After an hour, they're totally fine with 5. After 4 hours of starvation, then 5 isn't so good. It doesn't actually meet their needs. So we might predict that we would see more variance seeking in this starved bird. And that's the basic idea behind risk-sensitive foraging theory, is that you can, if you've got options, the orange option and the green option, then if you plot your threshold, then you really have to say across all of the possible outcomes for my options. So now that they're variable, the orange has 2 things that could happen. You could have sometimes you're under threshold, sometimes you're over threshold, whereas in the green, you're always over threshold. So when you have low thresholds, you see animals going for consistent rewards. When you have high thresholds, then you see animals going for variable rewards because that minimizes their downside risk. And that often is summarized with these continuous distributions. And I might go and start with this next time just to make sure that we all have this down. But it's still that basic idea that when your thresholds are low, you go for risk. When your thresholds are when your thresholds are low, you go for consistency. When they're high, you go for risk. And you can buy down risk sometimes by getting rid of game. And I'll cover that next time so that we're not so rushed. Okay, but then that was basically it. So let's close with this one. All right, so again, these aren't, I know I rushed through this, but we'll go and review this next time. But which predator is more likely to accept prey items with variable rewards? A predator that currently has low energy, a predator that currently has high energy, an herbivore, or a carnivore?